Good evening to all. I welcome today's speaker, Professor Atanu Bhattacharya. His talk is the fourth in the series of Professor Avadhesh Kumar Memorial Lecture Series. This lecture series is an endeavor by the Alumni Association of the Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies, Saurashtra University, Rajkot, which was founded by Professor Avadhesh Kumar Singh. It is now my privilege to introduce Professor Atanu Bhattacharya. Professor Atanu Bhattacharya is a Dean, School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies, Central University of Gujarat, Gandhinagar. He completed his studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and the University of Warwick, United Kingdom. His research interests are focused on the interaction between technology studies, English language studies, and culture studies. His current research interests are specifically in the area of Bengali science fiction as it developed during the 19th century in and around the city of Calcutta. He is at present working on a book project on science fiction in colonial species as well as one on ICT and language education. He is an amateur theatre enthusiast and in his pastime tries to write plays. His talk is titled The Storm and the Garden, Speculative Fiction in India. I now invite Professor Bhattacharya to begin his talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henna. I hope I am audible enough.
Yes, sir. You are
all
audible.
Right? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Please forgive me if the lights go off and the talk stops in between, because there are huge storm clouds over here, which is kind of relevant to the topic that I'm talking today, which is titled Storm and the Garden. What happens over here is if there is a big storm coming up, then the lights tend to go off. I
Yes,
hope that doesn't happen.
Yes, sir. We hope that it goes smoothly.
Yeah, thank you.
We are facing the same, but let's hope it goes smoothly.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna.
You're welcome.
I would first like to thank the Alumni Association of the Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies of Saurashtra University for having me here for this talk. And I would like to thank Professor Sanjay Mukherjee, all my colleagues, Dr. Ravi Singh Zala, who's here, Professor Kamal Mehta, and all the other colleagues in the department who have been a part of this department for a very long time now. I would like to share my presentation before I go on. So just bear with me for 2 minutes before I do that. I hope everyone can see the screen and see the presentation.
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay. So as you can see, I have titled the presentation as The Storm and the Garden, Speculative Fiction in India, keeping in mind the theme of these series of memorial lectures that have been organized by the Alumni Association. And I'm going to talk about two specific texts during the course of my presentation. And we will see what these two texts do in terms of speculative fiction in India. And the two texts that I have chosen are one from the late 19th century and one from early 20th century. They are separated only by 15 or 20 years. I have been interested in 19th century literature over a period of time now. And since the area now, we know that 19th century literature is extremely vast, and the area that I know of, I can claim some knowledge of at least, is the area of Bengali literature in the 19th century. So I'm going to speak on two specific parts of fiction, specific instances of fiction, which came up at the end of the 19th century and then again at the beginning of the 20th century. More about that later as we go on along the presentation. Now, it is really a privilege and a great honor to be speaking in this memorial series, which is for Prof Avadhesh Kumar Singh, who has been truly a scholar in the real sense. And I speak of him in the present tense because I feel that he's still with us. And sir, I hope you are watching us during this interaction. Um, it is always a great tribute to a great scholar to engage in more dialogues uh, among those who are trying to emulate his scholarship. And I can only say that it is the mark of a great scholar that he could initiate those dialogues, and those dialogues are still going on. Um, uh, on a personal note, of course, I knew him for a very long period of time, for more than 20 years since I arrived in Gujarat. He has been kind of a part of my life. And in fact, one of the earliest conferences that I attended when I first landed in Gujarat was actually in the Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies in Saurashtra University. And it was Professor Singh who had organized that conference. And I was kind of a youngish lecturer trying to find my way through the uh, through the bylanes of scholarship. And when I attended that, it was on Indian aesthetics, I remember, and I still remember the inaugural speech that he gave, which was where he traced the history of the Indian intellectual tradition right from the early days, from Sanskrit to Pali and to 19th century, where I still very distinctly remember where he talked about Bhartendu Harishchandra uh, and the contribution of Hindi scholarship in the 19th century. That kind of started my interest in 19th century, and it is always a mark of a great scholar that can inspire other kinds of scholarships. So it is really a privilege and an honor to be speaking during this memorial series. Uh, it was it's also probably uh, a good time to remember that the last time that I met him was was in an interview board where I was the interviewee and he was the interviewer. And uh, when his turn came, I remember when he was asked to ask questions to me. He said that, well, I don't have any questions for you, Atanu, but I would like you to continue to do whatever you are doing right now. So thank you again, sir, for all the wonderful guidance and wonderful inspirational leadership that you gave us, and the pathways that you showed us in terms of uh, bringing out scholarship or bringing out the urge to look into issues that have not been looked into. And it is kind of a fit tribute, I guess, on my part, at least that's what I'm trying to do during this presentation, to talk about an area which I thought has not been really explored that well in the history of Indian scholarship. Uh, so what we are going to do, therefore, is we're going to look at a particular kind of speculative fiction, and that's what we are planning to look at. So what I'm going to look at is what is specifically speculative fiction. And as you are aware of the fact that speculative fiction is not something that is that has been very clearly defined. We know that it is a kind of an umbrella term that is used for various kinds of writings, and especially in Indian context, these kind of writings can range from reworking of myths, reworking of legends, reworkings of fantasy stories, futuristic writing, utopian writing, and of course, what we know in common parlance as science fiction, because science fiction is a major category that Western scholarship looks at. But when we look at uh, the, uh, the term science fiction in the context of India, we find that it is not exactly the shape that it takes in the West, and there are different sorts of negotiations that happen when we talk about science fiction in India. So instead of calling it science fiction, probably scholarship would like to call it more of speculative fiction. And speculative fiction, therefore, has gained attraction in recent times as a term that encompasses almost all sorts of writing that could be considered to be utopian or futuristic, but does not necessarily contain science or scientific kinds of writing that we associate with science fiction. So we are going to look at briefly at what this speculative fiction is, and it's extremely difficult to define, especially in Indian context. And we must keep that in mind, I think, as a kind of a reminder to us that speculative fiction in India would be extremely difficult to define, primarily because it has got a whole range of writings that exists. Also, the fact that speculative fiction is not new. In fact, science fiction can be traced to, if you want to trace back science fiction in the West, then you will notice that you could probably go back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was published in 1818. But if you look at speculative fiction in India, then it has, again, quite a long history. So we could go back to 1835, which I'm going to talk about a bit later, and it goes on even today. So even if you look at the narrow category of science fiction, it could be seen that we have a huge history of almost 165 years of science fiction. In fact, proper or hardcore science fiction, as we call it, came into existence in the West about in the 1860s and the 70s. And we have examples of what we call speculative or science fiction earlier than that in India. So it's an interesting area to look at. A caveat to that, of course, is that I'm going to look at only the region of Bengal because that's the region that I know of. But if necessary, I will give examples from other regions where this speculative fiction developed over a period of time. The question is, of course, why did speculative fiction develop in India? So what led to it? And that is something that I'm going to briefly look at during the course of my talk, because that's an interesting area in itself, because it looks at the arrival of science, especially the colonial Enlightenment science, colonial models of science, colonial ways of looking at or producing knowledge through scientific models. These were mostly top-down models. The colonial model was based on the idea that it was British imperialism or East India Company imperialism till 1857 that produced a certain kind of a scientific model of knowledge. And that scientific model of knowledge was kind of top-down. It was pushed down into different forms of institution. But there was also a kind of a resistance to that scientific model. And it is within this negotiation, it is within this space of a top-down model and a bottom-up resistance that we can locate speculative fiction within it. So we'll look at briefly what the history of science is and what leads to a kind of speculative fiction that we look at. And of course, that relates to the responses that we had to the colonial scientific paradigm, which was established over a period of almost 50, 60 years, right from 1765. And what happens when people start responding to that scientific paradigm? What kind of fictional responses came in? And how do those fictional responses transform or change or modify or even resist to a certain point the larger colonial scientific paradigm? And that's what I'm planning to do, I'm trying to do through the two texts that I'm going to look at. Finally, I'm going to end with a few general concluding remarks about the notion of speculative fiction in India. Again, let me be very clear that I'm going to restrict myself to only these two stories, but if during the discussions questions come up, I'll be happy to answer questions or queries or explanations on how did this tradition continue, what is happening now, etc. Again, my readings have been mostly in Bengali, in Bangla literature, and in the region of Bengal till about independence and even after independence. But I can venture, I can think of other texts as well that came into existence in other regional languages. So that's the plan that we are working about. Now, the thing is that before I begin, I would, of course, like to talk about a bit about what the colonial knowledge model was, what was the colonial knowledge model of science, and where do we place speculative fiction within that colonial model of knowledge. And my focus, as I told you, will be on early writers, but we will look at later writers if possible. In Bengal, at least, I mean, I can tell you that there is almost been an unbroken tradition, both in writings in Bangla as well as in writings in English. In fact, out of the two texts, one of the texts is in Bangla, which has been translated now, and the other is in English, which was originally written in English. So I'm going to look at these two texts and see what are the possibilities of speculative fiction and what are its relationships to the larger theme of ecology, larger themes of ethics and ecological ethics per se. So that's what my remarks are going to be about. Now, before we start, of course, I would like to read out, and please bear with me on this, a pretty long excerpt from one of the stories that we're going to discuss today. And the two things that we're going to look at are actually two stories, though the second one is a longer story. But I'm going to read out an excerpt from a story that was originally written in 1886. I'm going to talk more about the story later as we go on. But this story, very briefly now, is about a storm which is supposed to hit the city of Calcutta. And the story was written in 1886. It was revised in 1896, and then it went through another revision in 1921 when it was published in a volume. But the interesting thing about the story is about a storm which is going to hit the city of Calcutta. The story is called the Runaway Storm, or the Runaway Cyclone, whatever you call it. In Bangla, it is called Palatak Tufan, the storm that ran away, literally translating it. And the story is basically a discussion of why did the storm run away from Calcutta, or why did the storm never hit Calcutta. And if you look at the story has two parts. The first part is about these different sorts of conjectures, different sorts of theories about why the storm ran away. And the second part is a more personal explanation of why the storm ran away. We'll come to that later. But just to give you a background to that story, before I read this excerpt, I thought I can place the excerpt within that background. So I'm going to read this out, and so please bear with me. This explanation, I told you that the first part of the story is a series of explanations of why the storm did not hit the city of Calcutta. And this is one of the explanations given by a professor who is German, who is giving a lecture in Oxford University about this very strange phenomenon of the runaway cyclone, of the runaway storm. And this is what he has to say. And I read, according to the professor, a cyclone is merely a form of the atmosphere. Let us first examine how the atmosphere came into being. When the earth was simply molten metallic matter which had come out of the sun, it did not have an atmosphere. How oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen came together out of this molten matter is still one of the mysteries of creation. Even more mysterious and fascinating is the evolution of life. Let us assume that the atmosphere somehow came into being. What is an even greater problem is how this atmosphere does not dissolve and vanish into space. This is because of Earth's gravitational pull. Gravity works according to relative mass. That which is heavier is subject to more gravitational force and is therefore relatively tied to its own position on the Earth. The lighter object is less influenced by gravity and is therefore relatively free. This is why when we mix oil and water, and please do remember this reference because this is an important reference in the story. This is why when we mix oil and water, the lighter oil generally floats to the surface. So this reference to oil and water is an important reference in the story. Hydrogen, being lighter, tries to escape the Earth's atmosphere. However, it is not completely free of the gravitational pull. However, we doubt if the truth of relative mass is applicable to areas other than physics. And please note this now, the change in the tone and the change in the voice. For instance, in the country called India, the men are heavier and relatively free. The women who are relatively light are tied to the domestic space. In other words, men and women do not follow the laws of gravity. In any case, only matter remains attached to the earth by virtue of its gravity. After the death of matter, it is free of the earth. When man gives up his ghost, the force of gravity no longer restricts his movement. Some people say that even in death, man is not free of earth, because even ghosts have to move under the commands of the Theosophical Society. In the case of matter, however, it is incorrect to say that it attains 5 states, and the word in Bangla over here for 5 states is Panchabhut, because we see only 3. When bombarded with radium, matter breaks down into 3 states, alpha, beta, and gamma. Thus, when matter is broken down, the non-matter escapes into an unknown space. While living, however, it is impossible to escape the force of gravity. And this is just a part of the lecture that the fictional professor gives at the University of Oxford. Now, what you are immersed in this short excerpt that I've given you, is a kind of a stupendous passage where there are huge amounts of voices clashing. And so it begins as a scientific principle. It explains the laws of gravity. It explains the laws of relative mass. It explains the laws of surface tension. And then it moves into a completely personal space of how these laws do not apply to gender relations, because men are heavier and therefore, according to laws of gravity, should be actually tied to earth, but are generally more free in India. While women are lighter, or supposedly lighter, but they are comparatively free, they're comparatively more tied, more pulled by the gravity, etc. And then, of course, there is a very snide, very satirical remark on Theosophical Society, and how it controls ghosts, etc. So within the same passage, what you have is this interesting mix of different sorts of metaphors that keep on clashing with each other through these polyphonies of voices. It's almost different sorts of voices speaking together. And of course, the entire thing is based within this idea of the nonsense. So while science or rational explanation should give you sense in its more core meaning of the word sense, what you have is a mixture of sense and nonsense all the time during this passage. And this is the general tenor of the story. So you have got these massive theories of science, but at the same time, these extremely personal interventions where the nonsensical comes in. And the nonsensical is always introduced not as a kind of a pure nonsense, but as a kind of an ironic sidestepping. So you have an irony of humor, which kind of questions the rationalistic space that has been created. So if you look at the first part of the passage, it creates a rationalistic space. And then the second part of the passage, it constantly questions that rationalistic space. What I would like you to remember is the structure of this excerpt that I read. So the first part of the of the excerpt is it creates a certain sort of rationalism or scientific rationalism that colonial science brought in. And the second part of the story kind of questions that rationalism through different sorts of references, which do not seem to be very rationalistic at all. This is an interesting pattern through almost all early stories that you go through in the Bengali archive, in the Bangla archive, or even in early speculative fiction in India, especially in the region of Bengal. It's a very interesting mixture of this tenets of rationalism, but on the other hand, this questioning of the tenets of rationalism through references, through irony, through satire, through humor, etc. As you can notice over here, as I told you, that there is a reference in the story to the mixing of the oil and the water, which plays a very important role later in the story about explaining why the storm goes away. We'll come to that later. We'll move on to a second excerpt, and again, please bear with me. It's a shorter excerpt than this one, which I'm going to read from a story. This story, the one that I read right now, was published, as I told you, around 1886, later again revised in 1896. The second excerpt that I'm going to read out was published in 1905 by a very famous educationist in Bengal called Begum Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussain. I'm going to talk about her a bit more later. The story was written originally in English. It was sent to for publication to a magazine called Indian Ladies' Magazine, which was incidentally published by Sarojini Naidu. The story is about a woman, as the name suggests, the name of the title of the story suggests, the narrator of the story is someone called Sultana. And Sultana is uh, goes off to sleep at the beginning of the story, and she wakes up in a dreamscape, in a dreamland almost. And this dreamland is called Ladyland, where the entire landscape, the entire place is governed by women, and the men have all been shut up in domestic spaces. So the reversal of roles have happened. But this land is also governed by science. So the women are women of science. To give a more recent example, it's almost like the Amazonian women, or even a more recent example from films, it's almost like the Wonder Woman's world. So this is the space within which Sultana wakes up, and she goes around and sees all the scientific marvels. And then at the end of the story, and this is where I will read out the excerpt from, the queen of this land explains the principles of this land to Sultana. And this is what she says, and I quote: no trade was possible with countries. What she means is no trade between Ladyland and other countries. So no trade was possible with countries where the women were kept in the zananas and so unable to come and trade with us. Men, we find, are rather of low morals, and so we do not like dealing with them. We do not covet other people's lands. We do not fight for a piece of diamond, though it may be a thousandfold brighter than the Kohinoor, nor do we grudge a ruler his peacock throne. We dive deep into the oceans of knowledge and try to find out the precious gems which nature has kept in store for us. We enjoy nature's gifts as much as we can. Now, as again you can notice in the story, is that it is about a certain kind of a science, it is about a certain kind of an acceptance of a certain kind of a science, but you have a gender reversal where the science is now controlled by women rather than men. But at the same time, a very interesting reference to nature again. So on the one hand, the first story that we looked at it begins with an ecological disaster. So a storm going to hit the city. And the second story that we are looking at is actually a promotion of nature, a promotion of a certain kind of ecology, a promotion of a certain kind of a philosophy of ecology that seems to have lost its way in the hands of men. And this is something that is kind of constant throughout the speculative fiction that you see in India. This engagement with ecology, this engagement with the ethics of a certain kind of living, the engagement with the ethics of being itself. And Begum Ruqayya Shekhawat said, in fact, when she published the story, apparently her husband told her that this is a terrible revenge that you have taken on men. But more about that later as we go on in the presentation. Now, before I go on, I will just like to point out to you that even before these stories, there were quite a lot of speculative fiction. For example, Kailash Chandra Dutt's Journal of 48 Hours, published in 1835. There was another piece that was written in 1845. So there is a almost unbroken tradition of writing speculative fiction during this period. But I will briefly discuss them a bit later. So these are the two stories that we looked at. I'm sorry about the script because I couldn't find the English translation script. So on the left-hand side, what you can see is the script, the story that I quoted from at the beginning, called Palatok Tufan. And then the brackets in Bangla, it is written Boigyanik Rahosyo, which basically means, if you literally translate it, it is a scientific mystery. It is not science fiction. So the story is about a scientific mystery that needs to be solved. And it's interesting that the beginning of science fiction in India does not begin with a utopian space. It does not begin with...
Hello.
Yeah, sorry.
Atanu, sir, sorry to interrupt you, but your screen is not visible.
Oh, okay.
Huh.
Is it visible now? No? Okay, I'll
No,
share
sir.
it again.
Yeah. It is
It's okay
visible now,
now?
sir.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Yes.
So what you have then is, so the two stories that I discussed was uh, the one on the left is the Palatok Tufan, and in the brackets that you see is Boygarik Rahosyo, as it is, as I told you, the translation is scientific mystery. And it's interesting that science fiction, as it begins in India, does not actually begin with a utopian scheme of things, but actually about a presentation of the present. So an engagement of the present. So the storm is going to hit Calcutta now. It is not going to be in the future. Similarly, Sultana's dream is not again about the future. It is about the present and what is happening in the present. So science or scientific fiction, as Hugo Gernsback, one of the authors, early theorists of science fiction, he called it scientific fiction. He combined two words, scientific fiction. He called it scientific fiction. So scientific fiction in India almost began with an engagement with the present. And it is this engagement with the present that produces, so we don't have utopian science fiction, or utopian this thing. So we don't really know whether to call it speculative fiction, because speculative fiction assumes a certain kind of a utopian, utopianness, a certain kind of a futuristic way of looking at things. Uh, Now, if you look at these two stories, it is interesting that why are we, and this is the second point that I thought I'll discuss with you, is that why are they responding to a certain kind of science? Why is this science or the scientific model so important during this time? Now, the reason is that we need to go back and delve into the history of science, that history of colonial science, and I'm not talking about science in the general sense, but history of a specific kind of colonial science that enters India with the coming of the East India Company. And we must remember that for the first from 1765, when East India Company got the Diwani of Bengal, as it was called, uh, from Shah Alam, the Mughal emperor, which was handed over to Lord Clive, you had science entering in different ways, especially the colonial models of science entering India in different ways. And if you look at the Diwani period, especially when it was done in 1765 after the Battle of Buxar, science can be seen in three ways that it enters. Remember, these are overlapping ones. So these three ways of science entering India are kind of overlapping streams. But I will kind of separate them for the purpose of this talk. But we'll have to remember that they kind of feed each other in some way. The first one is, of course, expansionist, because when the Diwani of Bengal happened, uh, the East India Company got access to a piece of land, which was a considerable piece of land, which was modern day Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, parts of Awadh, and Assam. And so what you had is this massive piece of land suddenly coming into the East India Company's kitty. And they needed to track this land. They needed to have a certain kind of systems to be introduced into this land, including taxation systems, for example, navigation systems, transport systems, military systems, etc. And one of the things that happened with this expansion of the East India Company was introduction of different sorts of technological medium to track the land, what we can call mapping the terrain. So you had to map the terrain. And therefore, cartography, for example, making of maps became extremely important. In fact, one of the earliest maps that was made by the British in India was a map by James Rennell, and it was called a map of Hindustan. Interestingly, it was not the map of Hindustan at all. It was the map of Bengal, in those days of Bengal. It was called a map of Hindustan because that was seen as Bengal. Moreover, this region was extremely rich in terms of its taxation. So the East India Company got really, really rich during this part, and because it was earning so much of revenue from this land, it needed technological innovations to control this land. So the first model of science that you see that enters India is through expansionist modes. So because you need expansion, because you need to expand the territory, what you do is you bring in technology to help in that expansion. And therefore, We know that by 1848, therefore, the railways was introduced, and the picture that you see was the first railway engine that was invented. The picture is actually there in the Shivaji terminus in Bombay even today. And the first train started running from Bombay to Thane and Thane to Bombay in 1853. You had the coming of the telegraph for improving communication. In fact, it is said because the because the East India Company had the telegraph installed by 1850s, one of the reasons why the 1857 war was won by them, because they had a better communication system in place. So the expansion included all these scientific innovations that came in. And we have to remember that these scientific innovations that came in was not innocent in terms of improving the territory, but it was a part of mapping the territory. The second model of science that came in was, of course, an educational model. And we know a lot about this as students of English. I'm sure that we have all gone through Macaulay's Minute, how it came, how English medium instruction became an important part of the education system. And of course, by 1857, when the universities of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras were established, the scientific or rational model of teaching, of pedagogy, of instruction became a major point in the colonial education system. Of course, you had also establishment of the medical colleges. The Calcutta Medical College was established. You had establishment of different sorts of educational institutions which had English medium instruction. Again, science was an important aspect of these educational institutes. And we know that it has a long history, and I'm sure that all of you know about it. So this was the second model of science that was propagated or promulgated or disseminated through education systems. And remember, large number of translations happened from English textbooks into regional languages, from regional languages into English, etc. And of course, this was all linked to the picture that you see is of the government house that was built in 1803, which became the center of controlling the empire in a certain sense. So it was all linked to the control command mechanism. So even education was a part of that control command mechanism that was produced during this period. So this was the second model that science followed. The third model, which is something that Professor Singh himself was very interested in, was what we can call the appropriative model. Now, the picture that you see is that of Asiatic Society, which still exists in Calcutta. And what you have is in the Asiatic Society, of course, we know that Asiatic Society did a lot of translations, and it was more famous for translating Abhigyanam and the Bhagavad Gita because it funded translations from Sanskrit. But it also did a lot of translations from Indian scientific texts, from Sanskrit, from Pali, from Arabic, from Persian. So a large amount of translations happened from texts that already pre-existed the colonial regime. And these translations helped the development of science within the colonial regime itself. So it was a kind of an appropriative science. So you appropriate other knowledge systems and then almost, in a case of early plagiarism, claim it as your own. So you have an appropriative model of science where you appropriate the models of science that pre-exist and then claim it or appropriate as its own. If you have read Amitabh Ghosh's Calcutta Chromosomes, this is exactly what he looks at in the novel, how the idea of the malaria vaccine, which is claimed by the British, Roland Ross, actually pre-existed before the British came in, and the British kind of appropriated that knowledge of the vaccine from local scientific community and then claimed it as its own, etc. So even today, I mean, people are questioning that appropriative science. And Asiatic Society was at the center of that. There were other kinds of models, but let's just stick to these three. Of course, remember that these are all parts of the same spectrum, and they were linked to each other in different ways. But as I told you, that these are mostly top down. So these were determined by the British imperialists. They were determined by company officials. They were determined by Governor General. They were determined by the English Parliament, etc. But the Indians also responded to this in different ways, and it will be interesting to see all the responses that came in. But I'm going to just stick to three over here, and then during the discussions, if there are questions regarding this, I'll be more than happy to take those. Now, one of the responses that you see, this is a painting called, a kind of painting that developed during the 19th century called Calicut Painting. And Calicut Painting basically painted local incidents, local events, etc. Now, as you can see from this painting, one of the major debates that happened around this time was women's education. So obviously, men had more access to this educational science, this educational medium, these universities, these colleges, these schools, and other medical colleges. In fact, the first woman who graduated from a medical college called Kadambini Ganguly was almost never could practice in India. So there was a huge debate about women's education in India at this time. I'll not go into the details, and if there are discussions coming up later, I'll be happy to take questions on that. Now, there were discussions, for example, should the same model of science be taught for women? There were actual textbooks that were written during this period, which had a different kind of a science for women than the kind of science that was taught for men. And a lot of scholars have written about this entire notion of women's education, what form should it take. There were huge amounts of discussion, debates in print culture, in newspapers, in journals, in publications, and in speeches, in lectures, etc. So this is one response that happened from the colonized, from the oppressed, in that sense. So they responded to it in different ways. And women's education is a good way to trace how these responses happened. The second one is a bit more community-based. And after 1857, what we see is that the British pursued a very vigorous policy of making, because the 1857, the rebellion was seen as a kind of governed by the Mughal Empire. And therefore, anyone who was associated with the Mughals was seen as an enemy. And what basically happened was that there was an active policy followed by the Governor Generals after 1857, after 1858 actually, that kind of marginalized more and more, especially from government jobs, from educational institutions, anyone who was associated with the Mughals. And this led to a kind of a community response to science. And the picture that you see is of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who formed the Aligarh Society in the 1870s, which then went on to become the Aligarh Muslim University, which we know today, where he said that the only way that the community can come out of this British oppression is by becoming scientific, becoming more rational. In fact, in his first speech that he gave in Aligarh Society archives, Aligarh Society meeting, he said that he almost compared the embracing of science as embracing of light from darkness. So you have to move from that darkness towards light. And this was a community response that again has a different trajectory altogether. And Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is one of them, but there are quite a lot of other Muslim intellectuals who participated in this second response to the colonial model of science. The third response was a bit more interesting because it kind of rejected Western science completely. So it said that Western science is simply repetition of whatever we have in ancient texts. And you have a large number of writers who wrote about this. I have just given you the example of Radhakant Dev Bahadur, who was a big zamindar in Calcutta, who said that we do not need to accept the Western model of education. We do not need to accept the Western model of science at all. We need to completely reject it wholesale, and then think of our own texts that produce a different kind of a science. So that model was also available. So that is why the 19th century is such an important complex period. So you have different sorts of voices emerging in different sorts of spaces, and they all kind of coexisted at the same time. But other than these models, the fourth model that I would like to stress on, and which can lead on to the two stories that I began with, is what I call the fifth element. Now, this model of science is much more interesting. The picture that you see over here is of an institution that was founded in 1870s by someone called Mahendralal Sarkar. And the institution was called the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science. There were quite a lot of these associations that came up about science. But this model was very different. So on the one hand, they accepted the colonial model of science in terms of its truth, in terms of its believability, in terms of its provability. So you could prove things that's more rational, etc. But at the same time, they said that we'll have to go back to our roots to understand it. So there was a space of negotiation. So everything that the Western science tells us is not something that we have to accept as it is. We have to check it. We have to, because these are the models that they have given us. They have given us a certain kind of rationality, and we need to use that rationality against them to check whatever they are saying. So you have access as well as rejection. So you accept whatever they are saying, but you also kind of reject it at the same time by applying the same categories of rationalities that Western science produces. And this is what Mahendralal Sarkar had to say. Despite the inherited submission to a foreign yoke, we have inherited a mind not inferior in its endowments to the mind of any nation on earth. And what he was obviously focusing on, emphasizing on, was the fact that the model that you have is a good model. So he was not completely rejecting the Western model of science, but was questioning it through the same rational principles that they believed in. So this is not simple nativism or indigenism. So you cannot really say that, okay, this is going back to the roots. No, it is not. It is kind of taking from the West, taking from the Western model, but also questioning it, usurping it, claiming it, reclaiming it, modifying it, etc. And this was created a space of negotiation. And my argument during this talk is it is through this space of negotiation that what we call speculative fiction today could emerge. Because the speculative fiction was the perfect media within which this space of negotiation could be negotiated, could be placed, and that is what happened with the two stories that we saw. So if you remember the first story that we looked at, it looked at the actual models of science. So it talks about gravity, it talks about relative mass, it talks about surface tension, but at the same time questions it through all these irony, satirical forms, etc. The second story that we saw, again, accepts the rational model of science, for example, the women's world where science is used, but at the same time, it questions it through the notions of violence, through the notions of nature, through the notions of ecology, etc. So if you go back to the history, as I told you, the first speculative fiction that deals with this is by Kailash Chandra Dutt from the famous Dutt family of the 19th century, to which Toru Dutt also belonged. And the first speculative fiction can be traced back to Kailash Chandra Dutt, and the book that he wrote was called A Journal of 48 Hours of the year 1945. And 1845, from the same family, Shoshi Chandra Dutt wrote The Republic of Odisha, a page from the annals of the 20th century. Both these texts are available. So if you're interested, you could go back to this early beginnings of speculative fiction. Remember, almost 165 years old. And then, of course, we looked at Runaway Storm or the Runaway Cyclone, from which I read. You have Sultana's Dream, from which again I read. And you have a continuous tradition in Bangla. You have the idea of Isuram Hushiyar by Sukumar Rai, the father of Satyajit Ray, the film director. And of course, you have Hemendra Lal Boshu, you have Premendra Mitra, so you have a continuous Adrij Bardhan, everyone. I mean, till today, there are speculative fiction writers in Bengal. So it's almost an unbroken tradition of speculative writing in Bengal. Now, coming back to the stories, I promised you at the beginning that I will talk about the story in a bit more details later. Now, the story that we began with was written by Acharya Jagdish Chandra Basu. Now, Acharya Jagdish Chandra Basu, as you know, was one of the most revered scientists of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Now it is accepted that he was the one who actually talked about the electromagnetic waves that could carry sound. He was the one who invented the idea of life in plants, etc. So he had made massive contributions to science. But there is a background to that. Jagdish Chandra Basu actually went to Cambridge to do his doctorate. He did his doctorate over there, came back. He was appointed in the Presidency College, and in the Presidency College, he was given the post of assistant professor. But he was given a salary which was not the same as the salary of the white professors that used to work in the Presidency College. So what you have is this indigenous, this Indian man, this Indian brown man coming back. He has been promised that if you study a certain thing, if you have educational access to the colonial model of science, then you will have equal rights, you will have equal opportunities. But he comes back and he fails to find that those equal rights and equal opportunities. It is said, we don't have evidence for this, but it is said that he never really touched his paycheck. Though he used to get his paycheck from the college, he never really touched it. He actually earned his money from his inventions. And the story that he wrote has even a more interesting background. The story was written under a pen name. He didn't use his real name. And the story was written in response to a story writing competition that was organized by his nephew. His name was Hemendra Mohan Bose. And the story writing competition was organized. Hemendra Mohan Bose actually was an entrepreneur, and he had a company which sold hair oil, which was called the Kuntaleen hair oil. The Kuntaleen hair oil was supposed to have magical properties, and it was supposed to cure your baldness, it was supposed to keep your head cool, etc., etc. There are very interesting advertisements of the Kuntaleen hair oil. And he became very rich, Hemendra Mohan Basu, with this selling of the Kuntaleen hair oil. He also used to sell perfumes, actually. One of the most famous brands of perfumes in the 19th and early 20th century was a brand of perfume called Dilkhush. And this was produced by Hemendra Mohan Basu's company. So what you have is this man, this entrepreneur, he designs a story writing competition. And as a part of that story writing competition, Jagdish Chandra Basu submits the story. He calls it the Runaway Cyclone, the Palatak Tufan. Now, let's come to the story. So the story, as I told you, is a combination of voices. There are two parts of the story. The first part has newspaper reports about why so one of the newspaper reports, for example, says why the storm ran away. And it says that because the Governor General of Bengal actually had gone out for a walk near Diamond Harbour, where the storm was going to hit. And when he reached the harbour, when the storm saw the Governor General, the storm became so scared that it ran away. So you have all these extremely funny satirical pieces coming up. You have Met Department reports. You have the Shimla Observatory report. You have media speculation. You have gossip of why the storm finally ran away. This is part one. Remember, that also contains the professor's speech at Oxford University of giving a scientific explanation of why the storm ran away. The second part of the story is actually a personal piece. It's a personal story of the narrator, who tells you that actually what happened. I'll tell you what is the truth of this. Remember, it is a scientific mystery, so the mystery has to be solved. So the narrator tells you that, okay, what actually happened was that I was under too much of stress because I was working in a college, and because the college was making me do a lot of work, I was losing a lot of hair. Now, before I come to this point, I must say that when the story writing competition was announced, Hemendra Mohan Basu said that anyone can submit a story for this competition, but there is a condition, and the condition is that the story must have a reference to Kuntaleen hair oil. because if the story does not have a reference to Kuntalin hair oil, then the story will be disqualified. In fact, Palatak Tufan went on to win the prize in the story writing competition. It won the first prize. It was later revealed that it was Jagdish Chandra Bosu who wrote it. So coming back to the story again, the narrator tells you that I was losing a lot of hair because of the stress at my college, and therefore my daughter said that why don't you go for an outing? So what I decided was I went to Diamond Harbor, I took a boat, and I went out. But as I went into this boat so that I could have some fresh air and I could think about other things other than my college work and my scientific work, I also carried a bottle of Kuntalin hair oil with me. Now, as we approached the sea, we found out that there was a big storm, a big cyclone approaching. Now, as you are aware of the fact that most of the cyclones that approach are actually approaching the coast because it is in contact with water. It's the water temperatures that determine the cyclone. Because the cyclone is formed because the water gets warmer and then it moves towards land, which is cooler, etc., or the other way around, etc. So it's the difference in water temperatures that produces a cyclone. So when the cyclone was approaching me, everyone got extremely scared and everyone was thinking what was going to happen. We are all going to get killed. So because I was a scientist, what I realized was, okay, I immediately took out my bottle of Kuntalin hair oil and I poured it into the sea. Now, remember the speech that the Oxford professor gave, that oil floats because of surface tension. Now, because the storm could not hold on to the water, and because the oil started floating in the sea, the storm could not continue onwards, and because of the laws of surface tension, it lost its force and disappeared. And that is where the story ends. Now, what you have again is this very interesting personal interjection. So, on the one hand, you have these grand theories of why the storm ran away, these grand scientific explanations of why the storm ran away in the first part of the story. While in the second part of the story, you have this extremely personal engagement with nature, this personal engagement of explanation of a personal act of nature. It might be funny, it might be humorous, it might be even fantastical, but it is this notion of the personal within the grand theory of things that the story brings in. And it is this engagement of the personal, this personal ethics, this personal nature of, so it becomes almost a kind of an engagement with nature, not in terms of a great theoretical model which produces nature or a great theoretical model that saves a city, but it is a simple act of doing something which saves the city, that produces a story. And it is this ethicality, it is this nature of engagement, of an ecological engagement that produces the story. Similarly, the second story that we looked at, and the Sultana's Dream, what the story does again is in this fantastic land that Sultana lands in. It's a very short story, so please do read it if you have not already. Is that there is a gender reversal, but when Sultana is taken around this lady land, this fantastic land where women are the rulers, what you see is the violence of science has been tamed. So instead of roads, you have these avenues filled with flowers. Instead of kitchens, which is supposed to be made of walls and concrete and other things, you have these vines and you have this nature inside your kitchen where you can pluck your tomatoes, where you can pluck your vegetables from the kitchen walls themselves. So the entire universe of Ladyland has been transformed into a natural world. And why did the women do it in the story? Because they felt that the men were using science for creating a certain kind of a violence on other states. So science was used for wars before this. Science was used to dominate other people. Science was used to kill people. And it is to counter this that science now has an aesthetic function. Science doesn't have a function of violence. Science has a function of creating beauty, of creating a certain kind of ethical, ecological sense, a sort of balance between what is a scientific model. Remember, both of the stories do not reject the colonial scientific model, but they kind of negotiate that scientific model through the personal, or through the ethical, or through the ecological. So, summing up, the two stories that I have very briefly discussed then brings us back to the question of ethics and how does ethics relate to a certain kind of literature. And both the stories we have seen that the ethics is highly personal. Remember, in the first story, the explanation of the cyclone going away and an ecological disaster waiting to happen, which was supposed to kill millions of people, is taken away by a personal act, by a personal ethical act, in the case of Jagdish Chandra Bose. In the case of Sultana's Dream, it is taken away by a gender reversal, but it is also taken away by the idea of changing the nature of science from violence to a certain kind of ethical responsibility towards nature. This also is related to what we have been discussing as a part of this memorial series as ecology and literature. So the ecological is not simply some grand theory of ecology. The ecological is also highly personal. It is an individual act. So in a sense, the two stories can be almost seen as the beginnings of eco-criticism. In the case of Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussain, it's almost the beginnings of ecofeminism. And unfortunately, we don't go back to our own sources to look at these early explanations, this early engagement with nature, with early engagement with a certain kind of ecological consciousness that existed even within the Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussain was a well-known feminist, even within this feminist space that was created in India. The third thing is a term that the possibility of deterritorialization. The word deterritorialization comes from Deleuze and Guattari, who use it in their book called Kafka Towards a Minor Literature, where they say that when people like Kafka wrote in German, remember Kafka was an Austrian Jew, but when he was writing in German, he was using the language of majority, which was German, to transform that language to bring his own personal anxiety, his own personal angst, his own personal beliefs, his own personal ethics. And if you look at these two stories, you will see that there's a huge amount of deterritorialization that is happening. So the story or the territory of colonial science that you see in this period, which is completely dominated by the Western colonial scientific model, is being slowly questioned through the question of personal ethics, the question of personal ecology, as we have seen earlier. And in case of Sultana's Dream, the story was actually written in English. And therefore, what you have is this questioning of the language itself. In fact, the story starts inventing language. So because zanana, the word is used for women's domestic space, the story actually says in this ladyland, you don't have zananas anymore, but you have mardanas. So which is no word, of course. But she invents words to challenge the nature of gender hierarchy. She invents words to challenge the nature of science itself through these deterritorializing of language, but also questioning the territory of scientific space. And it is through these negotiations that I think the speculative space in India can be looked at. And it is something that we might start to trace not only through its historical trajectory, but also through the different works of literature in the speculative genre that has been produced over a period of time. I think I'm going over time, so I'll stop over here. Thank you so much again to the Alumni Association and to my colleagues and to the organizers and to the entire audience for listening so patiently to me. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions, discussions, queries, whatever. Thank you. Before I end, these are some cartoons, these are some sketches from Sukumar Rai, whom I mentioned. And he has a famous line in his story, Diary of Hasuram Hushiyar, where he says, we have to create our own maps to explore this territory. And this is what I believe speculative fiction in India does. It creates its own maps to explore the territory of Western science, at least the beginning of Western science. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Atanu. And this was really engaging. Although we had literally at your end and at ours storm brewing and going on, but I suppose most of us were able to listen to your talk as well as also your slides, interesting slides were also visible. So the communication was not much hampered.
Thank you.
And in that sense, I'm very happy that this event finally could take place without much of an interruption. I take note of the fact that we have amidst us professors whom we all revere, Professor Prashant Sinha, Professor Rambhav Barode.
Hello, sir.
As we have others from across India, I was looking at the number of participants, and we have touched around 40 from across India. By some speculative turn of the dice, right now, I mean, speculative turn of the dice falling in whichever direction, I'm the incidental president of the Alumni Association. I will fail in my duty if I formally do not thank you, Professor Atanu Bhattacharya, for this very, very engaging talk in the area that is, I think, still developing, not only in India, but if we look at this genre, not much of it is being taught really also in our syllabi. Although at one level, taking speculative or to speculate etymologically, we would say as such, like all fiction, I mean, all fiction is imaginative, but would you say that speculative fiction is a little more imaginative? Let me start with your response on this, and then let others also join in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mukherjee. Well, the term speculative fiction actually is used by Vandana Singh, speculative fiction writer, a contemporary speculative fiction writer. She has a very wonderful story called Delhi. In one of the earliest volumes that came out on speculative fiction in India, it was called, I think, Post-Colonial Speculative Fiction or Post-Colonial SF or something like this. It was a volume that was edited by Nalo Hopkinson and Upinder Mehan, if I remember correctly. And Vandana Singh had a story called Delhi over there. And Vandana Singh says that she argues that it would not be right to call the kind of writing that is happening in India as science fiction. She was trying to debate what is science fiction and what is speculative fiction. And she says it would probably a more important term, a more appropriate term, to use speculative fiction as one of the categories rather than science fiction, because within speculative fiction, in India especially, in fact, the text that I looked at, if you look at the earliest text, 1835, now Kailash Chandra Dutt in the Journal of 48 Hours actually is speculating, because the story is set in 1945. So it is a imaginative utopian jump. And the story is about a person called Bhuban Mohan, who decides to fight against the British. He is defeated and dies at the end. If you go to 1845, Shashi Chandra Dutt's novel, which is the Republic of Odisha, there it's the tribal community which decides to fight against the British. It has kind of a reverberation of the Santal rebellion. And Though in that story, but it is again set in 1940, 1942. So it's again a speculative form. It's a utopian fiction. But in that story, the tribals win and the British are defeated. And within a few years, the British Empire disappears. And remember, this is written in 1845, when the British Empire is just establishing itself. And if you look at the later stories, like again, Sukumar Rai's Hisuram Hoshiare diary, it is not about the future again. So it's a very interesting mix of Hisuram Hoshiare diary. It's about the present. It's about a character who goes to the Banda Kush Mountains, which is probably in Afghanistan, which is probably the Hindu Kush, and he finds all sorts of strange creatures over there. The sketches that I showed you in the presentation before the last slide were of these strange creatures that he meets. He apparently takes records and comes back, but no one believes him. And then the story ends by this professor who has gone for this expedition saying that, but why don't you believe me? I am here. So you should believe me. I am personally present telling you the story. So why don't you believe my narrative? So this constant clash between what was seen as narrative speculation and scientific rationalism is something that speculative fiction in India kind of constantly deals with. If you remember, if you go back to the story of Jagdish Chandra Bose, it's again, the story is resolved through the insertion of the personal narrative form. It is not through a scientific rationalization. So speculative fiction in that sense is a very broad category in India. It would be difficult to kind of say that it's only science fiction. Therefore, I think people are avoiding that term when it comes to post-colonial writing, especially. Now, Calcutta Chromosome is part speculative, part science fiction. While there are recent English writers who are writing science fiction more, for example, Remy B. Chatterjee's Signal Red is very clearly science fiction, which is again set in the future. Or if you look at Priya Sarukai Chhabria's Generation 14, which is a novel that she published, though she is a poet, it is again set in the future where the world has come to an end, but it is very strongly science fiction, which draws from the feminist science fiction of the West. So you have all these mixtures happening. So I think speculative fiction is a broader category in that sense. The word speculative is primarily to indicate a sense of future, a futuristic fiction or utopianism. But it is not always so, because the stories that we looked at are not about the future. Sultana's Dream or Palatak Tufan are definitely not about the future. They're about the present. But it contains this scientific element, this element of a scientific story, of a science fictional story. And we don't really know whether to call it science fiction or speculative fiction, but it kind of fits within the larger umbrella term speculative fiction in that sense. I hope it answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you, Atanu. We have a question from Dibyendu Bhattacharya, who asks you, does this ecological speculative space get dominated by realism in most of the texts?
It's a very good question. It's very difficult to answer because I think we can safely, I don't know how safely, but if you look at the beginnings and if you include people like Kailash Chandra Dutt or Shoshi Chandra Dutt or even later writer whose name I forgot his name, the story is called Rahasya, Mystery. It's a very interesting space because if you look at Shoshi Chandra Dutt and Kailash Chandra Dutt, they are proto-nationalism. So they are fighting against the British, though the stories are set in the future. So they are realistic in that sense. It is not really fantasy. If you look at Jagdish Chandra Bose, it is very clearly satirical. It has a huge amount of double versedness. It has a huge amount of irony within it. If you look at Sultana's Dream, it is very clearly speculative, come feminist, come science fiction. But if you look at later texts, especially I can again vouch for Bengal, or even Marathi, for example, if you look at Jayant Narlikar, for example, Now, Jayant Narlikar is very clearly follows the space of science fiction as we know it in the West. But if you look at Bengal, it again has got a very interesting mix. So Premendra Mitra, one of the writers who wrote during this period and created this famous character called Ghanada, which I'm sure you will be aware of, uh, it's more of a tall tale, science fiction, fantasy, legend, all coming together. Shirshendu, for example, when he was writing, he again is a mixture of, he has a character called, again you would be aware of that, Tenida. So he again creates this tall tale mixture of speculative, mixture of science fiction, etc. Sunil Gangapathy produces that. Adrish Bardhan, of course, produces the more hardcore science fiction. Satyajit Ray is more hardcore science fiction, Professor Shanku. So the space is very, very scattered. We really cannot say it's limited to realism or related to the fantastic, etc. It kind of carries forward. There is a kind of a scattering of different kinds of subgenres within the larger speculative genre.
Yeah, thank you. There is another question by Dr. Sharoni Ghoshal, who wanted to know about the response of contemporary Bengali readers to this genre.
Unfortunately, I do not do much of audience studies or reception studies. But if you look at the amount of writing that is coming up on speculative fiction in India, I can give you a series of names. I mean, there is a scholar called Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay. Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay is the one who has translated Jagdish Chandra Bosu's Palatak Tufan, who works on the idea of how the speculative fiction can be seen. He actually doesn't call it speculative fiction. He calls it mythogerms. So a special kind of a fiction which brings in mythologies and legends and the modes of mythologies and modes of legends within the realistic space of writing that emerged in the 19th century. So he calls it mythogerms, these kind of speculative fictions. There is another person who looks at his name is Pablo Mukherjee. He has worked on Satyajit Ray's Professor Shanku series. He looks at Satyajit Ray as more of a part of the Nehruvian socialist model. And so therefore Professor Shanku is produced within that Nehruvian socialist model of science and is a perfect example of a science fiction produced within a contemporary Indian model of science that was accepted after post-independence. In recent times, are people interested in science fiction, or what is their reaction to it? I'm guessing that there still is, because one of the ways that what we know as young adult fiction or children's literature in Bengal, as it developed, we know that it was primarily through the contribution of large number of magazines. But by the early 20th century, we also had this concept of what was known as the Sharodiya. Sharodiya were, of course, you would be aware of this, but for the rest of the audience, Sharodiyas were these special issues that were taken out by these major publications in Bengal. And these special issues usually used to coincide later, almost always used to coincide with the Durga Puja. Because that was the holiday time, and during the Durga Pujas, these special issues by these famous magazines were taken out, which contained writings by famous writers, established writers. And even today that tradition continues. So the Sharodiya issues still contain quite a lot of speculative fiction. Till recently, I know, before Sunil Gangapathy passed away, he still had that entire series of Kakababu Shontu that continued. Kakababu Shontu is this famous pair of this thing, which also had fantasy and speculative fiction. And we know that a large number of writers still contribute speculative fiction to this genre. So I'm guessing that it has still quite a lot of popularity in Bengal. But of course, it's more globalized now, and people have access to different sorts of speculative fictions. And within this globalized world, people's reaction to speculative fiction is very different because they have access to more sorts of post-colonial fiction that is post-colonial speculative fiction that is available. So my remote guess, I mean, this is not based on any evidence at all, but if we look at studies till about 1990s, and especially the contribution of magazines and little magazines and Sharodiya issues, it was definitely very strong till about late 1990s.
There are two questions, I'm clubbing them together on the connection between, and this is one from Professor Zala and one from Bhakti Vaishnav, Dr. Bhakti Vaishnav. The linkage between speculative fiction and dystopia.
That's very interesting because except for the recent speculative fiction that is coming out from India, especially in Indian writing in English, there's been quite a lot of studies on speculative fiction in Indian writing in English, especially Indian English writers. Amitabh Ghosh, of course, Calcutta Chromosome is one of them, one of the earliest that produced it in the genre of Indian English. But you do have quite a lot of other writers who are doing it. I mentioned Vandana Singh, Priya Sarukai Chhabria is one of them. There is, of course, Rimi Chatterjee's Signal Red, and Tashan Mehta's The Liar's Weave, etc. So quite a lot of Indian, in fact, I forgot the name of the author. It is again a speculative piece which garnered quite a lot of response. It was published in early 2000. I can't remember the book now. He's a Gujarati person settled in Bombay. He wrote it in English. So Indian English writers are responding to speculative fiction in some way, in a certain way. And these are mostly dystopian. So the answer to that question is, if you look at Indian English writing, then the new Indian English writing that is responding or that is producing speculative fiction are mostly dystopian in nature. So Amitabh Ghosh is not very clearly dystopian. But if you look at early writings, it is not. For example, Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussain, the story that I quoted from, is a utopian fiction. It is not dystopian. Jagdish Chandra Bosu is neither utopian nor dystopian. It's actually about explanation of a scientific mystery. And though some of the speculative fiction, Kailash Chandra Dutt and Shashi Chandra Dutt, for example, is set in the future, it is definitely not dystopian. It is responding to a present condition of imperialism, colonialism of the British Raj. And while Kailash Chandra Dutt's book ends with the death of the hero, it is not dystopian in that sense. So there is a clear distinction between the kind of productions of speculative fiction in regional languages, and probably making too big a generalization. It may not be true in all cases, and the production of speculative spaces in Indian writing in English. So Indian writing in English seems to be overwhelmingly dystopian, while in regional languages, it seems to be overwhelmingly utopian. So there is a clear line of demarcation, I think, that can be drawn.
Interestingly, the next question is about whether we have this speculative fiction quite in number in India or not. So Dr. Chirag Aratia wants to ask about, he would like to know about whether speculative fiction is meager or whether it is quite sufficient in number.
I mean, we do have quite a lot of speculative fiction writing in English, as I mentioned. Now, it is available now. So if one wants to research post-independence writing, there is quite a lot of that. Thankfully, there has been a lot of translations. of many speculative writers. Jayant Narlikar, for example, who wrote in English as well as in Marathi, has been translated extensively. Satyajit Ray's Professor Shanku novels have been almost entirely translated now. Sukumar Rai, whom I mentioned, has been translated. Kailash Chandra Dutt, Shashi Chandra Dutt wrote it in English, so it was not in Bangla at all. So many of the writers are available in translation. So we do have quite a sizable archive now. It's no more. Previously, they were kind of limited to local regional languages, but now because of the translation efforts, quite a lot of this speculative fiction is available in English. So it is quite a big archive right now.
There's another question by Mihir Dave, who wants to know about the health of translation, especially done by Indians, and says that it's understandable for the British to use translation as some of their strategies back then, and wants to ask you about the selection of translation picked up by Indian translators that often show India in a negative light.
I don't know whether I'll be able to answer that question because in terms of, I would like to restrict myself to speculative fiction. The translations that have happened in speculative fiction seems to be mostly of writers who are pretty well established in the field. So in Bangla, for example, the translation that has happened the most is of Satyajit Ray. The entire Professor Shanku novels have been translated. And there are quite a few of Professor Shanku novels. The other writer that has been translated quite extensively now is Premendra Mitra. So his Ghanada stories have been translated quite extensively now. There are a few other, Adrij Bardhan, for example, another pretty famous post-independence writer who ran a science fiction magazine in Bangla, has not been translated. So there are certain writers who are very well established in the field. People like Satyajit Ray, who was a world figure. He has been translated. Premendra Mitra, because he was a major writer, also was associated with Bollywood. He wrote the script of many of the films over there. He has been translated. So most of the established writers are getting translated. The minor writers, some of the writers that I mentioned, for example, Hemendra Mohan Boshu, for example, has not been translated. But there are quite a few gems available. So there's quite a lot of scope available for translation over there, I'm guessing. I'm sorry, I don't know whether that answers your question, but of course, we know there is a politics to translation, but that is how it is.
Yeah, I think the focus was mostly on speculative fiction, and we might have another session about translation and its politics and going on. So thank you very much. There is a question by Riyanka Sharma about the genre of climate fiction, Anthropocene, and whether these can be related to science fiction.
Large number of theorists are doing it now. If you look at theory now, because we have moved away from the grand era of theory that happened in the 80s and 90s, or the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you will see that there is a lot of convergence happening in terms of theoretical models. So if you look at theoretical models that you are quoting from, for example, post-humanism, or the idea of the post-human, the idea of the post-method, or the idea of the post-theory. Ecological theory itself draws heavily from other disciplines. So it is becoming much more interdisciplinary in that sense. As I ended my presentation by saying that we will need our own maps to kind of map these territories. We need our own maps to understand these territories that exist. So we will need more of convergences. So yes, I mean, ecological theory or the idea of the Anthropocene or the idea of a post-humanist model of theory or bringing in humanism in a big way or bringing in the question of ethics, for example. I mean, how does ethics play a role in a certain kind of ecological framework that we live in and climate change that we live in? What is the role of ethics and where does the ethics come from? So all these are going to converge, and it is converging. I mean, especially in theories of ecological literature, you will see that a large number of theories are drawn from anthropological fields, from fields of medicine, fields of feminism, fields of sexuality, etc. So they are converging, and the convergence is important to understand any phenomenon as a broader category. It will be otherwise, I think, difficult to just look at it from a literary point of view. So as theoretical models, yes, there will be convergences, and I'm sure that these convergences are only good for understanding or interpreting the forms that we are looking at.
Thank you, Professor Atanu. We are almost nearing the end of our time. We generally keep this talk for 90 minutes. It has been so engaging that we have almost lost the track of time. It's very well that you end this discussion with map and territory, because it is very important to keep in mind who is the cartographer in not only in the literal sense, but in all metaphoric senses, and where do we stand as readers, writers, teachers, critics in mapping discourses. And in that sense, your talk has brought out the uniqueness of a genre from within our country, India. And I think inspired by your talk, people listening from all over India might be motivated to look into speculative fiction from Gujarat, for example, speculative fiction from Maharashtra, for example, and other parts of India. So I once again take this opportunity to thank you very much. And I especially also, I will not forget to thank all the audience, the listeners here, including senior teachers from our field. We touched somewhere around 41 people, and as the discussion is going on, in spite of the weather being quite inclement, we still have around 30 people with us. So this is really, I mean, numbers do not translate into success. That is not the map and the territory equation that we have. But I will once again thank you very much, and we will keep in touch. And thank you for helping this Alumni Association of ours and joining this memorial lecture in the memory of what you rightly say, our teacher in the present tense. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you again to the Alumni Association and the entire department of Saurashtra University. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Yeah.